Imagine you clock in for like an 8-hour shift at your job.
Huh?
You do your work, you produce whatever it is your company sells, and at the end of the day, you clock out,
Right.
And you feel pretty confident that you've earned your daily wage.
Yeah, that's how most of us think about it.
But what if someone were to, sit you down, pull out a ledger, and mathematically prove to you that you actually generated the entire value of your daily wage in just the first 4 hours of your shift?
Oh, wow.
Right. And that for those remaining 4 hours, you were, economically speaking, working completely for free.
Yeah.
Just, generating pure profit for someone else.
It is a premise that just completely upends how most people casually think about the economy. About their paychecks and about the fundamental nature of profit itself.
Because most of us just assume profit comes from buying low and selling high, right?
Yeah.
Or from some abstract, entrepreneurial spirit. Well, today we are looking at the man who dedicated a staggering portion of his life to proving exactly that mechanism. And we are diving into the very notebooks where he painstakingly built his case. So welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So our mission today is to unpack Volume 31 of the Marx and Engels collected works. And this isn't just some published book you'd buy in a shop in the 19th century, right?
No, not all.
We are looking at a very specific, really raw, and incredibly intense set of documents. This volume contains the central, beating heart of Karl Marx's massive economic manuscript of 1861 to 1863.
Yeah, and to get really granular for a second, we are exploring notebooks 7 through 12, which spans pages 299 to 66 and 36 of his original handwritten manuscript.
It's just a huge amount of material.
It is. But it's a fascinating primary source because it captures a mind actively at work. The 1861 to 1863 manuscript is effectively the second rough draft of what would eventually become his life's-defining work, Capital. But Volume 31 in particular is part of a sequence known as Theories of Surplus Value. So think of it as a critical history of the pith and marrow of economic thought up to the 1860s.
He's not just making this up in a vacuum.
Exactly. He isn't just sitting there dreaming up his own theories. He is actively reading, summarizing, and then forensically dissecting everyone who came before him.
It's like an intellectual autopsy.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
He's performing this post-mortem on what is often called bourgeois political economy. And just to clarify that term for anyone who might not spend their weekends reading 19th century economic theory, when Marx uses the word bourgeois in this context, he's talking about the thinkers and economists who represent the interests and the worldview of the capitalist class, the owners of the means of production.
Right. And we should definitely establish some ground rules here before we get too deep.
Please do.
Because these sources deal with highly charged political and economic theory. Marxism, critiques of capitalism, all of that. So we need to explicitly clarify to the listener that we are not taking sides here.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of Marx, nor are we endorsing the economists he critiques. Our goal today is strictly to impartially report on the factual content provided in the source material.
Yeah, we just want to help you understand the historical and theoretical ideas contained within these specific texts.
Exactly. Think of us as your tour guides through a very complex, occasionally pretty aggressive museum of economic history.
I love that. Okay, so let's walk into the first exhibit.
Yeah.
Because before we can understand the specific thinkers Marx is attacking in Volume 31, we need to understand the overarching puzzle he's trying to solve.
Right, the big mystery.
Yeah. And this manuscript is a behemoth. We're talking 1,472 pages across 23 notebooks in total, under the working title, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy.
Which is a very humble title for such a massive work.
Right. But the central problem he wrestles with, which he establishes in the prefaces to Volumes 30 and 31, is this massive contradiction that had stumped the greatest economic minds for decades.
Yeah, it's the problem of reconciling something called the law of equivalence with the actual existence of profit.
Okay. Can you break down the law of equivalence for us?
Sure. So the law of equivalence is basically the bedrock of classical market economics. It essentially states that in a truly free, functioning, and competitive market, commodities are exchanged at their true equivalent value.
Okay, so a fair trade.
Exactly. If you trade a chair for a certain amount of money, that money exactly represents the value of the labor and materials embedded in that chair. The raw materials were bought at their true value. The tools were purchased at their true value.
Everything balances out.
Right. It sits in perfect equilibrium. It is an exchange of absolute equals.
But if that is true, Marx spots this glaring mathematical impossibility, right?
He does.
Because if all commodities in a market are exchanged at their true equivalent value, how does a capitalist ever actually make a profit?
That is the million-dollar question.
Let's use a tangible analogy and actually do the math on this. Imagine I decide to open a bakery.
Okay, I like where this is going.
I go to the market and I buy flour, which costs me, let's say, $2. I buy yeast for $1, and I pay $1 for the electricity to run my oven.
Okay, so that is $4 of input costs, all bought at fair equivalent market value.
Right. And classical economics dictates that the value of the resulting loaf of bread is simply the sum of those inputs,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So the bread is inherently worth $4. If I sell it at its fair market value, I sell it for $4, I break even, the inputs equal the outputs.
But in the real world, the bakery owner sells the bread for, say, $10 and pockets a profit.
Exactly. So the economists Marx is reading in the British Museum, they couldn't figure out where that extra $6 came from if the law of equivalence was real.
Yeah, they kept looking for it in the marketplace itself. They thought profit just came from merchants marking up prices, buying cheap and selling dear.
But Marx says that doesn't work, right?
Right. Marx argues that buying cheap and selling dear doesn't actually create new value. It just shifts existing wealth around from one person's pocket to another's.
So it's just a transfer.
Yeah. Think about it. If I trick you into paying $10 for a $4 loaf of bread, society as a whole isn't $6 richer.
Oh, I see. I am $6 richer and you are $6 poorer.
Exactly. The total amount of value in the economy remains exactly the same. So Marx is hunting for the origin of new surplus value, value that expands the total wealth of the system, without violating that rule that everything trades at its fair value.
Okay, let's unpack this solution because this really feels like the foundational key to unlocking the rest of Volume 31. How does he solve this riddle?
Well, he solves it by realizing that previous economists completely failed to understand the specific nature of one very particular commodity that the capitalist buys on the open market.
And what's that?
That commodity is labor capacity, or labor power. Marx points out a really crucial distinction here. The capitalist doesn't buy the results of the worker's labor. They buy the worker's capacity to work for a set period of time.
Wait, we need to pause here because the source material brings up two terms that sound similar but are vastly different. Use value and exchange value.
Right, those are critical.
The text says the secret lies in the difference between the exchange value of labor capacity and its use value. Could you give me the plain English breakdown of those two concepts?
Absolutely. Let's go back to your bakery. A commodity has two sides. Its exchange value is what it costs to buy it on the market. Its use value is its actual usefulness, like what it physically does when you consume it.
Okay, so for a loaf of bread.
The loaf of bread has an exchange value of $4, and its use value is that it satisfies human hunger.
Makes sense.
Now, apply that to the worker. A worker's labor capacity is a commodity. Its exchange value is the daily wage, which is the cost of the food, shelter, and clothing necessary to keep that worker alive and able to return to the bakery the next day.
So if it takes like $50 a day to keep a worker housed, fed, and rested, their fair market exchange value is a $50 wage.
Precisely. And the capitalist pays that $50, honoring the law of equivalence perfectly.
Okay, so nobody's being cheated in the marketplace.
Right. The capitalist bought the labor capacity at its true value. But then the capitalist consumes the use value of that commodity, and the use value of labor capacity is the actual act of working. And here's the magical property of human labor, according to Marx. The act of working is the only thing in the universe that actually creates exchange value.
Okay, I see where the math shifts now. So the capitalist pays the $50 daily wage, the worker clocks in, and maybe in the first 4 hours of mixing dough and baking, the worker produces enough loaves of bread to cover the cost of the flour, the yeast, the oven, and their own $50 wage.
Yes, exactly. At hour 4, the worker has fully replaced their own value.
But the capitalist bought their capacity to work for the whole day.
Right. So the worker stays for another 4 hours. Those next 4 hours, they continue to bake bread, creating new value. But the capitalist doesn't have to pay for those hours because they already bought the day's capacity at its fair market rate.
So those extra 4 hours are unpaid surplus labor.
Yes. That surplus labor creates surplus value, and that is where profit comes from.
Wow. So the capitalist obeys the law of equivalence in the marketplace by paying the fair wage, but extracts the profit on the factory floor by consuming the labor beyond the point where it replaces its own cost.
That's the core of his theory, yeah.
But I have to ask you, Marx spends hundreds of pages in these notebooks tearing down other people's books. Does he really need to do an exhaustive multi-volume history lesson just to make this one mathematical point?
It seems like overkill, doesn't it?
Yeah. Like, is he just getting bogged down in academic beefs, or is there a structural reason he's so obsessed with the economists who failed to see this?
It is entirely structural. What's fascinating here is that Marx firmly believed that you cannot establish a scientific foundation for a new political economy without first tracing exactly how the existing capitalist production relations are reflected in the minds of the people defending it.
Wait, so he's diagnosing them.
Basically, yeah. He needs to show how the ideas of bourgeois economists are fundamentally distorted by the very system they live in. He has to prove that their failure to see the difference between labor and labor capacity isn't just an accidental oversight.
It's not just a typo in their math.
No, it is a necessary ideological blind spot.
Because if they acknowledge that profit comes from unpaid labor time, the whole moral justification for the system collapses.
Exactly. They have to believe profit comes from the market, or from the entrepreneur's cleverness, or from the inherent productivity of capital itself.
Right, because if they admit it comes from extracting unpaid hours from a worker, the illusion of equal exchange is totally shattered.
So Marx maps their minds to map the defense mechanisms of the system itself.
Which brings us to the primary focus of Volume 31, and a man who definitely did not think he had any ideological blind spots, Adam Smith.
Ah, yes, the father of modern economics.
Right. If human labor is the secret ingredient to surplus value, Adam Smith is the historical giant who first dragged labor into the spotlight of economics.
He absolutely is. Adam Smith made a massive leap forward by identifying labor as the source of a nation's wealth, moving away from older ideas that wealth was just, hoards of gold or silver.
Yeah, totally. And Notebook 7 of Marx's manuscript is heavily dedicated to concluding his critique of Smith. And Marx zeroes in on a very specific, highly debated section of Smith's work, which is his distinction between productive and unproductive labor.
Right.
And the source material points out that Thomas Malthus, another famous classical economist, he famously remarked that this differentiation is the cornerstone of Adam Smith's work and the basis on which the main line of his reasoning rests.
So we aren't just nitpicking a footnote here. This is the main event of classical economics.
It is the fulcrum on which Smith's entire macroeconomic worldview balances. So Marx closely examines Smith's definitions because Smith is attempting to differentiate between labor that produces capital and labor that merely consumes revenue.
Let's bring this down to earth for the listener.
Yeah, please.
If you are listening to this deep dive right now and you work in a massive factory assembling electric vehicles, Adam Smith looks at you and says, you are a productive laborer.
Okay, because I'm making something physical.
Right. The car you build is sold, it generates a profit, and the capitalist takes that profit and builds a second factory. Your labor has produced capital. It acts as an engine of continuous economic growth.
Makes total sense.
But then Smith looks at a whole other class of workers. The opera singer, the personal servant of the factory owner, the barista making coffee, the doctor, the teacher. Smith categorizes all of these people as unproductive laborers.
Okay, wait, I have to push back hard on that because that makes absolutely no logical sense even in a capitalist framework. How on earth can Smith look at a teacher and call them unproductive? I mean, a teacher literally educates the future factory worker. A doctor heals the factory worker so they can get back to the assembly line. They are maintaining the human machinery of the economy. How is that not producing value?
It's a very natural objection, and it's one a lot of people have, but you have to understand the rigid parameters Smith is operating within, which Marx is brilliantly exposing here.
Okay, what are the parameters?
Smith defines productive labor strictly as labor which exchanges directly with capital to produce more capital. Unproductive labor, in Smith's view, is labor which exchanges with revenue, meaning the profits or wages already earned, merely for the sake of consumption.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. I'm not sure I quite get the difference between exchanging with capital versus revenue.
Let's look at the factory owner. He makes $1 million in profit from the electric cars. That $1 million is his revenue. If he takes $100,000 of that revenue and hires a personal chef, a piano tutor for his kids, and buys front row tickets to the opera, he is simply consuming his wealth.
Right, he's just spending his money on living.
Exactly. The labor of the chef, the tutor, and the singer doesn't fix itself into a tangible, vendable commodity that can be sold again to keep the cycle of accumulation going.
Oh, I see. Once the meal is eaten or the song is sung, the value is just gone.
It is consumed. Therefore, to Smith, the labor is unproductive because it doesn't result in capital accumulation.
So it has absolutely nothing to do with whether the job is socially useful or necessary for human happiness.
Nothing at all.
It is entirely about whether the labor functions as a battery to store and multiply capital for an employer.
Precisely. And this is the massive truth about bourgeois economics that Marx extracts from Smith. Marx points out that Smith is actually being brutally honest about how capitalism views the world.
He's saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah. Marx unpacks how Smith's dual definitions reveal that bourgeois economists can only see labor's value in terms of its ability to enrich the capitalist.
Okay, let's test this framework. What if I am a brilliant author and I spend 5 years writing a masterpiece novel in my basement?
Yep.
I self-publish it, I sell it directly to readers, and I make just enough money to buy groceries and pay my rent. Am I productive or unproductive, according to Smith and Marx's reading of him?
Under this strict economic definition, you are unproductive.
Even though I wrote a masterpiece.
Even though you wrote a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Because you are exchanging your labor for revenue to consume for your own survival. You are not generating surplus value for a capitalist who will reinvest it.
That is so bleak.
Now let's flip the scenario. Suppose you are a hack writer churning out low-quality clickbait articles for a massive media conglomerate.
Go.
You're paid a wage, and your articles generate immense advertising revenue for the corporation, which they use to buy up more media companies.
In that case, I am productive labor.
Yes, because you are producing capital, you are producing surplus value for a boss.
That's wild.
Marx highlights this to show a total paradigm shift. In the eyes of classical economics, productive simply means exploitable for profit. It strips away all sentimentality about the nobility of work.
That is incredibly stark. But Marx doesn't just stop at definitions of labor, does he?
No, he goes much deeper.
Because the source notes that to fully grasp Smith's framework, Marx dives deep into what he calls the exchange of revenue and capital. And this seems to be where Smith gets tangled up in his own math.
It is, and it's a vital part of the manuscript. Marx is looking at how a capitalist economy reproduces itself macroeconomically year after year.
Right, because an economy isn't a single transaction. It is a continuous breathing organism. Everything that is consumed must be replaced.
Exactly. If you eat the grain, you have to plant more grain.
If you wear out the machines, you have to build new machines.
And Marx pays special attention to how constant capital is replaced.
Okay, constant capital. Let's define that.
Constant capital is Marx's term for the means of production, the machinery, the raw materials, the factory buildings. It's called constant because, unlike human labor, it doesn't create new value. It just constantly transfers its existing value into the final product.
Okay, so the cotton transfers its value into the shirt.
Right.
So where does Smith get confused?
Marx notes a very complex issue in Notebook 7, which is the problem of replacing the part of constant capital which does not enter into circulation.
What does that mean in practice?
Consider a massive steam-powered textile loom in a factory. The raw cotton goes into the factory, gets turned into a shirt, and goes out into circulation on the market to be sold.
Right, the shirt circulates.
But the physical loom itself stays bolted to the factory floor. It does not circulate in the market.
It just sits there, slowly degrading over a decade.
Yes. A tiny fraction of the loom's value is transferred to each shirt. Let's say the loom costs $10,000, and it will weave 10,000 shirts before it breaks forever.
Okay, so each shirt contains $1 of the loom's value.
Exactly. When the capitalist sells the shirt, they get that dollar back. Over 10 years, they slowly hoard those single dollars until they have $10,000 to buy a new loom.
That seems straightforward enough. I mean, it's just depreciation, right?
From the perspective of the individual capitalist, yes. But Marx is interrogating Smith on how the total society replaces that massive fixed machinery.
Oh, macro level.
Right.
Yeah.
While the capitalist is hoarding those dollars for 10 years, who is currently employing the laborers to build the replacement loom, how does the society allocate resources to build heavy machinery that won't actually be sold for a decade?
Oh, I see.
Smith struggled with this. He often confused the total revenue of the society with its gross product. He couldn't quite map out how the sector that builds machines, what Marx would later call Department I exchanges, with the sector that makes consumer goods like shirts, which is Department II.
Because Smith is so focused on the individual exchange, like the baker selling bread, the weaver selling shirts, he loses track of the massive structural replacement of the societal infrastructure.
Exactly. Marx uses this to show that Smith's view of how the macroeconomy reproduces itself was flawed, because he didn't fully separate the replacement of old fixed capital from the creation of new consumable revenue.
He kind of blurred them together.
Yeah, Smith thought the entire value of a commodity ultimately resolved into wages, profit, and rent, completely forgetting that a portion of the price has to replace the degraded machinery.
It's like Smith is trying to map the circulatory system of the human body, but he can only see the capillaries and completely misses the major arteries.
That's a really good analogy.
But here is where the manuscript takes a really fascinating turn. To understand why Adam Smith got tangled up in these specific arteries, Marx doesn't just critique him in a vacuum. He takes a detour backward in time.
Yes, he does.
In Notebook X, Marx takes a digression to look at the school of thought that heavily influenced Adam Smith, and that is the physiocrats.
The physiocrats are an absolutely vital piece of this puzzle. They were an earlier mid-18th century French school of economic thought. And Volume 31 contains a very specific, extensive digression by Marx on a document called the Tableau économique, which was created by a man named François Quesnay in 1758.
I've seen pictures of Quesnay's tableau, and it is one of the most visually and conceptually wild things in economic history.
What really is?
When you look at it, it is essentially the first attempt in human history to map the macroeconomic flow of wealth. I always picture it as an early, primitive version of a printed circuit board diagram.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, because Quesnay draws these literal zigzagging lines crossing back and forth across the page, trying to trace exactly where the wealth flows between different classes in an economy.
The circuit board analogy is highly accurate because Quesnay was trying to show a closed loop of reproduction. He basically divided society into three distinct classes.
Okay, what were they?
First, the productive class. But for the physiocrats who were writing in a heavily agrarian pre-industrial France, productive meant exclusively agricultural laborers and farmers.
Just farmers. Okay.
Second, the proprietary class, which included the landlords, the nobility, and the king, who receive rent.
Naturally.
And third, the sterile class, which encompassed all artisans, merchants, and manufacturers.
Okay, we have to stop at the sterile class. Calling a manufacturer or a blacksmith sterile sounds completely insane to a modern ear.
It does.
I mean, we just talked about how Adam Smith viewed the factory worker as the ultimate engine of productive growth. Why on earth would Quesnay look at someone making a hammer or weaving a coat or building a carriage and call their labor sterile?
It comes down to their mechanical understanding of where surplus actually comes from. The physiocrats observed a very basic biological fact of agriculture.
Which is?
If you plant a single grain of wheat in the soil, nature does something miraculous. It provides a physical surplus. A few months later, you don't just get your 1 grain back, you get a stalk with 50 grains.
Right. Agriculture literally multiplies matter.
Exactly. It yields a tangible physical excess beyond what was consumed to create it.
Yeah, like a cow eats grass and produces gallons of milk and eventually a calf. The physical matter expands.
But then they looked at manufacturing, and they believed that manufacturing merely reshaped existing matter.
Oh.
A blacksmith takes a lump of iron and a piece of wood and turns it into a hammer. To the physiocrats, the value of that hammer was exactly equal to the cost of the iron, the cost of the wood, and the cost of the food the blacksmith ate while hammering it.
The inputs equal the outputs, just in a different shape.
Exactly. No new physical matter was created. It was just a change in form. Therefore, it was sterile in terms of generating a net surplus for the nation. It merely maintained its own value.
So in Quesnay's zigzagging circuit board, all the true profit or surplus of the nation originates in the soil, pulled out of the dirt by the farmers.
Yes.
That surplus is then paid as rent to the landlords. The landlords then spend that rent on agricultural goods to eat, and on the sterile classes manufactured goods like fancy clothes and carriages, which gives the artisans just enough money to buy food from the farmers, keeping the electricity flowing around the board. It's an incredibly elegant, if totally wrong, system.
It is. And what's fascinating here is that Marx actually had immense respect for Quesnay.
Really? Despite the whole sterile artisans thing.
Yes. Despite the glaring error about manufacturing, Marx saw the tableau as an absolute stroke of genius.
Wow.
Because it was the first time anyone viewed the economy as a complete reproducing totality. Quesnay wasn't just looking at a single merchant trying to make a buck. He was looking at the entire metabolism of a society.
But Marx obviously has to correct the glaring error, right? What does Marx diagnose as Quesnay's fatal flaw?
Marx notes that while Quesnay brilliantly mapped the circulation of wealth, his model failed to locate the true social origin of new value. The physiocrats confused a physical surplus of grain with a social surplus of value.
They thought nature created the surplus, not human labor.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't conceive of value as an abstract social relation, they could only see it as physical stuff. A pile of wheat is bigger than a seed, so that's value.
Okay.
Marx analyzes this in Volume 31 to understand the concept of accumulation as extended reproduction. He's looking at how an economy doesn't just replace what it used in a static loop, but actually grows larger year over year.
Which he also debates with Thomas Tuck later in the manuscript, right?
Yes, Tuck was another economist who focused heavily on prices and circulation.
So how does this all connect back to Adam Smith?
Marx shows that the physiocrats' error thinking only farming is productive is the exact same intellectual stumbling block that Smith hits, just in a different form.
Oh, interesting.
Both Quesnay and Smith struggled to separate the physical properties of a commodity from the social relations of its production. Quesnay looked at the physical dirt. Smith looked at the physical durability of a manufactured good.
Ah, because Smith thought a teacher was unproductive because their lesson doesn't result in a physical, vendable object you can put in a box.
Yes, you've got it. Marx is pulling the threads together here. He argues that the secret to surplus value wasn't in the soil, and it wasn't in the physical durability of a factory good.
Where was it?
It was purely in the social extraction of unpaid labor time, regardless of whether that labor was plowing a field, weaving a shirt, or writing a ledger. The classical economists were obsessed with the physical form of the commodity, completely blind to the social relation of exploitation hidden underneath it.
It is truly incredible watching Marx assemble this massive intellectual jigsaw puzzle. He pulls the concept of the macroeconomic circuit board from Quesnay. He pulls the primacy of human labor from Adam Smith.
Right.
He identifies the pieces they got right and ruthlessly tosses out the edges that don't fit. But he doesn't just rely on the towering giants like Smith and Quesnay, does he?
No, he casts a very wide net.
Because to fully map this intellectual landscape, Volume 31 shows Marx interrogating a much more diverse chorus of thinkers. He's looking at the fringes, some who fiercely defended the brutality of the system and some who tried to reform it.
Yeah, it wasn't just the heavyweights. The manuscript features expensive sections on figures like Jacques Necker and Simon Nicolas Henri Linguet.
Linguet is fascinating.
He is. Marx specifically dissects Linguet's 1767 work, Théorie des lois civiles, or Theory of Civil Laws, and on the flip side, he heavily critiques an early socialist named J.F. Bray, focusing on his book Labor's Wrongs and Labor's Remedy.
Okay, let's explore these guys because they represent wildly different reactions to capitalism. Let's start with the defenders, Necker and Linguet.
Right, so Jacques Necker was a French finance minister right before the French Revolution. He was a practical man of the state.
Okay, a bureaucrat.
Very much so. Necker saw the accumulation of wealth by a tiny minority as a necessary, if somewhat harsh, reality of maintaining a civilized state. He recognized that the poverty of the masses was the precondition for the wealth of the nation.
But he was fine with it.
Yeah, he viewed it purely as an administrative problem to be managed.
The ultimate bureaucratic view, like, yes, they are starving, but the treasury is full.
Exactly.
But Linguet is different, isn't he? The source material suggests Marx found Linguet deeply fascinating because of how aggressively provocative he was.
Linguet is captivating because he essentially stripped away all the polite hypocrisy of the Enlightenment.
What do you mean?
Well, the Enlightenment philosophers were writing grand treatises about liberty, equality, and the social contract. Linguet looked at them and basically said, you are all liars.
Just called them out.
Completely. Linguet argued that all these majestic laws and property rights that bourgeois society was so proud of were nothing more than mechanisms for the rich to control the poor. He didn't hide the exploitation, he actually highlighted it.
He leaned into it.
He did. In fact, Linguet made the explosive argument that the modern free wage laborer is actually worse off than an enslaved person.
That is a massive claim.
Yeah.
What is the logic behind it? Because obviously a wage laborer is legally free to quit, whereas an enslaved person is property.
Right. But Linguet's logic, which Marx dissects with morbid fascination, is based on the economic incentives of the master versus the capitalist.
Okay, walk me through it.
Linguet pointed out that a master owns an enslaved person as a capital asset. If there is a famine or if business is slow, the master still has an economic incentive to feed and house the enslaved person, just as you would feed a workhorse to protect your investment.
Because they don't want their property to die.
Right. The master bears the cost of maintenance during downturns.
But the capitalist doesn't own the wage laborer.
Exactly. Lingo argues that the capitalist only buys the laborer's time. When a famine hits or the factory closes, the capitalist has zero obligation to maintain the worker.
They just lay them off.
They simply fire them, tossing them into the street to starve, and let society deal with the cost. The capitalist gets all the benefits of the labor without any of the long-term liability of maintaining the human being.
Wow.
Yeah. Lingwit saw the sheer, unvarnished violence and coercion at the heart of wage labor.
He saw the brutal truth of the system, but the crazy part is he defended it anyway.
He did. Lingwit believed that this horrific subjugation of the majority was the only way to free up a minority to create high culture, art, philosophy, and civilization.
He was an elitist.
An unapologetic elitist who thought the suffering of the masses was the necessary fertilizer for greatness. Marx appreciates Lingwit because Lingwit doesn't hide behind myths of equal exchange. He admits it's based on force.
So Lingwit says the system is brutal, and that's exactly how it should be.
Pretty much.
Now let's contrast that with the other figure Marx critiques in this section, J.F. Bray. Because Bray represents the complete opposite reaction.
Yes, J.F. Bray was an early utopian socialist, deeply influenced by David Ricardo's labor theory of value. He wrote Labor's Wrongs and Labor's Remedy in 1839.
Okay.
And Bray recognized the exploitation of labor perfectly clearly. He saw what Lingwit saw, that workers created all the wealth, but received only a fraction of it to survive.
Okay, so if Bray recognizes that workers are exploited and create all the wealth, why is Marx attacking him? It sounds like Bray and Marx are on the exact same page. Why dedicate notebook space to tearing down an ally?
It seems counterintuitive, but this is perhaps one of the most important theoretical distinctions in the entire volume, and it circles all the way back to the very first puzzle we discussed.
The law of equivalence.
Yes. Marx was highly critical of Bray and the other utopian socialists because, while they recognized the fact of exploitation, they completely failed to understand the underlying economic mechanism. They failed to understand the law of equivalence.
Wait, tie that together for me. How does the law of equivalence sink the utopian socialists?
Bray and the utopians believed that the root problem of capitalism was simply unequal exchange in the marketplace. They thought the capitalists were basically just cheating the workers, using a monopoly on power to pay them less than their true market value.
So they viewed exploitation as a moral failing.
Exactly, like a theft occurring at the cash register.
And if the problem is just that the market is unfair, then the solution is simply to fix the market.
Right. Their remedies, as Bray's title suggests, were legislative and reformist. Let's enforce fair exchange. Let's get rid of money and use labor notes where 1 hour of work equals 1 hour of goods. Let's regulate the capitalists so everyone gets exactly the value they produce.
But Marx says, you completely misunderstand the beast you're fighting.
Yes. Marx argues that the capitalist is paying the worker the fair market value.
Right, their labor capacity.
Yes. The exploitation doesn't happen because the market is broken or because the capitalist is a thief. The exploitation happens because the market is functioning perfectly according to capitalist rules.
Because they bought the capacity at its true value, and the surplus is extracted in production, not in exchange.
Exactly.
This is a devastating critique of reformism.
It really is. Marx is telling Bray that you cannot fix capitalism with remedies that try to make it fair. The extraction of unpaid surplus value isn't a glitch in the system. It is the very operating system itself.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Right. It is built into the DNA of wage labor. Marx believed Bray and the utopians failed to understand the inevitable historical trajectory of the system. You cannot just slap a moral bandage on a structural economic law.
So if you want to end exploitation, you can't just reform the exchange of wages. You have to abolish the system of wage labor entirely.
That is Marx's conclusion, yes.
Okay, I have to stop you there and push back on Marx himself.
Go for it.
Because up to this point, Volume 31 sounds like an incredible exercise in logic, but it is ultimately the work of the ultimate armchair critic.
I could see why you'd say that.
I mean, Marx is sitting in the reading room of the British Museum, safe and warm, reading books by Smith, Quesnay, Necker, and Bray, and just mathematically tearing them apart in his notebooks. It's brilliant philosophy, but it's incredibly abstract.
It feels removed from reality.
Yeah. How does this connect to the real world? Is he just playing with equations of use value and exchange value while the real world burns outside?
That is the exact critique many people level at economic philosophers, but Volume 31 provides a stunning counterargument to that. Marx makes a massive, visceral pivot in these notebooks.
Really?
Yes. He proves he isn't just dealing in abstractions. His theories are actually grounded in hard, terrifying empirical data.
This is where we move from abstract theory to gritty reality.
Precisely. Among his critiques of all these high-minded philosophers, Marx suddenly turns his analytical focus onto specific parliamentary documents.
Actual government data.
Yes. The most notable one analyzed in this volume is a document with a very dry, bureaucratic title, Factories. Returned to an address of the Honorable House of Commons, dated 24 April 1861, and it was ordered to be printed in February 1862.
The 1861 factory returns, what exactly are these?
These were official government reports. The British government had sent inspectors into the industrial heartlands, the textile mills, the coal mines, the ironworks, to compile statistics and write observational notes on the actual conditions inside the factories.
So Marx steps out of the abstract world of Adam Smith's neat definitions of productive labor, and he walks right onto the factory floor using the British government's own data.
He takes all that theory about the extraction of surplus value, and he shows what it actually looks like in human flesh and blood.
Wow.
When Adam Smith politely talks about productive labor generating wealth, Marx uses the factory returns to show what that productivity actually requires.
The human cost.
Yes. He cites the data on grueling, endless hours. He cites the statistics on child labor where 8-year-olds are working machines for 12 hours a day. He documents the extreme poverty, the maiming by unsafe machinery, the literal physical exhaustion of the working class who are producing the immense wealth of the British Empire.
He takes the polite economic theories, the theories that say the market is a perfectly balanced equilibrium of equal exchange, and shatters them against the reality of how the factories are actually run.
He essentially proves his theory of surplus value, that the capitalist system requires the relentless, insatiable extraction of maximum labor time, not through philosophical deduction, but through cold, hard statistics.
Because if profit comes from unpaid labor time, then the capitalist is financially incentivized to make the working day as long as humanly possible, right?
Yes, and to squeeze as much intensity out of every minute as they can. The factory returns prove that this isn't just a theory. It is exactly what was happening on the ground.
It's almost like he's acting as an investigative data journalist before data journalism was even a recognized field.
It's a perfect description. He is taking the government's own returns data collected by bourgeois inspectors, printed by a bourgeois parliament, and weaponizing it against their own ideology.
That's brilliant.
He proves that the extraction of unpaid labor isn't a theoretical concept discussed in the British Museum. It is the physical, bleeding reality documented in their own parliamentary papers. The polite law of equivalence results directly in the brutal reality of the factory floor.
The abstract math becomes human suffering.
Exactly.
Wow. Let's take a breath and recap the massive intellectual journey we've just taken through Volume 31 of the Marx and Engels collected works.
It's been quite a ride.
We've looked deep into notebooks 7 through 12 of the 1861 to 1863 manuscript. We saw how Marx started with the grand mystery of surplus value, solving the riddle of the law of equivalence by identifying the unique, value-creating power of labor capacity.
Right, distinguishing between use value and exchange value.
Exactly. We watched him dissect Adam Smith's cornerstone theory, revealing that Smith's definition of productive labor was simply a proxy for exploitable labor.
And exposing Smith's inability to map the replacement of fixed constant capital.
Yeah, the loom that never circulates. We decoded Quesnay's wild, zigzagging tableau economic, learning how the physiocrats brilliantly mapped macroeconomic circulation, but fundamentally confused a physical surplus of grain with a social surplus of value.
Nature versus human labor.
We watched Marx debate the brutal, unapologetic realism of Linguet, who admitted the system was worse than slavery because of the lack of maintenance. And we saw him dismantle the naive reformist remedies of utopian socialists like J.F. Bray, who tried to put a moral bandage on a structural law.
Because the market wasn't broken, it was working perfectly.
Right. And finally, we saw him anchor all of this high-minded theory in the stark, numerical, and horrifying reality of the 1861 factory returns, proving his equations with empirical data. But it is vital to remember that this volume is just the middle of his journey.
Oh yeah, the autopsy is far from over.
Just getting started, really.
Volume 31 sets the stage perfectly for Volume 32, where Marx will take these heavily refined weapons of critique, the concepts of constant and variable capital, of surplus value, of reproduction that he forged while battling Smith and Quesnay, and turn them onto the next great giant of political economy.
Even Ricardo.
Exactly.
That is a battle for another day. But as we wrap up today's deep dive into these notebooks, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over.
I'm curious what this is going to be.
We've spent an hour talking about 19th century theories, but think about your own job today. Think about your commute, your office, your factory floor, or the laptop screen you stare at all day.
Okay.
Based on Adam Smith's cold, hard definition, are you productive? Are you actively creating capital that your employer will accumulate and reinvest, or are you unproductive, merely providing a service that is consumed and forgotten?
That's a great question.
And more importantly, if Karl Marx were to get his hands on your workplace's equivalent of a factory return today, if he looked at your hours, your output, and your paycheck, how many hours of your shift are you working to replace your own wage, and how many hours are you giving away for free? What hidden surplus value would he find in your daily grind?
Something to think about the next time you clock in.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.